requires us to express thanks of the Senate for the exposition of public policy contained in the address of the President. Mr. Speaker, the key thing there is exposition of public policy rather than the politics contained in the address of the President. Mr. Speaker, the drafters of our Constitution envisage that at one point you might have a President who decides on what to tell Parliament away from the dictates of the Constitution. Thank you. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, in Article 132, beside requiring the President to address the opening of every new Parliament, it mandated the President to address Parliament at least once annually to brief Parliament of the measures taken in realization of national values and principles. Mr. Speaker, my comment on the President's speech will be on the policy aspects, what he said, and what we think he ought to have said. In the circumstances that many Kenyans find themselves in, the cost of living has skyrocketed. Mr. Speaker, this last election was an election about the cost of living, amongst many other factors. Promises were made to Kenyans that the price of basic commodities would stabilize. Assurances were made to Kenyans that the war in Ukraine and Russia had no role to play in the inflation that had visited the country. Mr. Speaker, from August to date, the price of basic commodities has skyrocketed. The price of maize flour, or what we call unga, has gone up by 8.4%. And these are statistics from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. The cost of electricity has gone up by 20.9% from August to date. The price of petrol has gone up by 17.7%. The cost of transport, Mr. Speaker, has gone up by 25%. The price of sugar has gone up by 19%. Inflation is at 9.2%, very dangerously close to the 10%. And, Mr. Speaker, this is the highest rate of inflation in the last 5 years. If the President's speech was supposed to be exposition of public policy, we would have expected that he would have given us a cogent plan to arrest the skyrocketing prices of basic goods, that he will have given us a formula to ensure that that is tamed. He didn't do that. Mr. Speaker, the elections were called with 7 million people having voted for the current government and 6.9 million people having voted for the opposing team. Kenya is divided right in the middle. The reason why the President is described as a symbol of national unity is that in our democratic process and experiment, there will be many people contesting for the same seat. At the end of the day, the person who's declared the victor occupies State House and assumes the role of symbol of national unity as well as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Mr. Speaker, we did not hear much about the President's plan for unifying the nation and for ensuring that national values and principles that are laid out in the Constitution are observed. I do hope that when the President comes for his first formal address to Parliament, he will be true to his calling as a symbol of national unity. He will refrain from throwing barbs at his opponents and will see himself as the father of all the 50 million Kenyans. Nobody in this country should be punished for the political choices they have made. Mr. Speaker, I am proudly on the minority side, and I am proudly going to play my role as an opposition senator. But the people of Homa Bay should never be in opposition. It is the elected leadership of Homa Bay that should be in opposition, not the people of Homa Bay. And Mr. Speaker, I do hope that this kind of thinking will permeate not just the House but the Presidency, to remember that the political choices that the people of Homa Bay made should not be criminalized.
Mr. Speaker, if my good friend, Senator Kajwang, read the speech or listened to the speech of the President, he was very clear. In paragraph 14, he said, I promise to lead an administration dedicated to just, fair, just and fair government to all Kenyans in order to deliver a Kenya for everyone. I commit to be loyal, hardworking, devoted president to every Kenyan. And my administration will serve all without regard to any distinction, real or imagined. Mr. Speaker, I think now Kajwang is trying to imagine things. The point of order is that Kajwang is misleading people by saying that the president is Senator Kajwang. Senator Kajwang is misleading people by saying that the president was not committed to every Kenyan. He was.
Mr. Speaker, in this House, the proverb of dry bones and old women has been said before. I don't want to use it, but they become jittery when old bones are mentioned in a proverb. I was encouraging the House, and I was encouraging the nation, that we must have a proper plan for national unity. And it is not just in the proclamations that the President makes, it must also be reflected in the proclamations that are made by his deputy and his troops, those who form part of his administration. Mr. Speaker, in exposition of public policy, I said the greatest threat to most Kenyans right now is a high cost of living, the sense of marginalization, but also corruption. This is an administration that has assumed that corruption ended simply because they were elected into office. This is an administration that does not want to talk about corruption because, as I said, that there are those who feel uncomfortable when old bones are mentioned in a proverb. The Corruption Perception Index, published by Transparency International, has placed Kenya in position 128 out of 180 countries, which means, by that definition, Kenya is still an extremely corrupt country. We would have expected the President coming before Parliament in realization of the national values and principles to make a comment on that. He still has an opportunity to do that when he comes for his annual address. Mr. Speaker, allow me to briefly touch on some of the things that the President said. In paragraph 47, he has talked about the issue of savings and the savings culture. It is true that Kenyans save about 10 to 12% of GDP, which is below the average in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in East Africa, but also very low for a low middle income economy. But Mr. Speaker, we asked ourselves whether in our assessment of savings, we are only focusing on the formal and forgetting about the informal. Where I come from, our people save in the form of livestock. I went to school from the proceeds of livestock. My father, whatever little he built, rental houses or a commercial property somewhere, was because he kept cattle. And at maturity, he would send us to the market to liquidate that cattle and convert it to cash. There are those of us from northern Kenya who owns herds of camels. And Mr. Speaker, they might be wealthier than many of us who keep our money in commercial banks and in fixed deposits. Because if you look at one camel, it's probably 150,000. And when you see those people walk around with the camels, you might look down upon them, but perhaps they've got more wealth than we do. Savings is not just about what is in the bank. And I'd like the President, because he brought this conversation about the informal economy and the hustlers, that we must look beyond what is sitting with custodians, what is sitting with pension funds, and what is sitting with the NSSF. Mr. Speaker, the 6,000 shillings matched with 2,000 shillings at the end of the year sounds very sexy. But if you break it down, Mr. Speaker, that's 8,000 shillings in a year. 8,000 in 20 years, that will be 160,000 shillings as a pension benefit to that individual. What can that do? We know when we go to our constituencies, 160,000 is something you'll spend in 2 churches. It sounds very nice that the President and the nation is going to contribute to match 2,000 for every 6,000 paid at the end of the year. But that is not enough, Mr. Speaker. I want the President to look at the regulatory framework that governs the financial services sector and particularly the pension sector. Mr. Speaker, I spent a few years in that sector. And I do recall there's a time the industry came up with a product called the Mbao Pension Plan. The Mbao Pension Plan was an idea to bring the Juakali sector into the formal pensions sector. And so the Juakali people would contribute 20 shillings on a daily basis using a mobile innovation using an app. Mr. Speaker, since 2018, the success of this Mbao pension plan has been affected by a number of issues. First of all, if we are going to allow our young people in the gig economy to come up with innovations similar to the innovations they've come up with in the banking sector and in the mainstream loans, the mobile lending sector, we must look at the various bodies that have been set up to regulate the pensions and savings sector. Insurance companies provide pensions products. They are regulated by the Insurance Regulatory Authority. Then you've got the Retirement Benefits Authority. Then you have got the securities, is it called NSE? Nairobi Securities Exchange, which has got its own regulator. Then you've got another regulator, a fourth regulator, which regulates SACCOs, which is another avenue of savings, SASRA. There are about 5, if not 6 regulators in that space. Why can't we streamline the roles of these regulators so that you can provide one combined product that will then capture pensions, will capture SACCOs, will capture a life insurance product, and then we can allow our innovators to come up with quick products rather than this matching of 2,000 to 6,000. I agree with the President that this is urgent and this is important, but I want to encourage him and his policymakers to think broadly. How do we bring into the formal economy the owners of camels and the owners of cows and the owners of goats? How do we bring into the formal economy the farmer in Kitale who has harvested several bags of maize? We came up with a warehouse receipt system bill in this House, Mr. Speaker. It has not been implemented because the grain in a farmer's warehouse in Kitale can also be looked at as savings. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, on paragraph 51, the President talks of the Senate fund. I was a bit disappointed today to encounter the committees in the order paper. I wish one of the things that we would have prioritized was a monitoring and evaluation select committee. Mr. Speaker, I've been in this House and I've been part of these conversations. We came up with regulations. We proposed that we get a 1 billion shilling fund. We came up with purposes of the fund, administration of the fund, structures, and even proposed that we have a monitoring and evaluation committee of the House. I want to encourage the House leadership at SPC. The President has shown goodwill. The only reason why we didn't get this money previously was that the President then did not have a lot of time for the Senate. Let's take advantage of that goodwill and ensure that that fund is in place. Mr. Speaker, on budget cuts of 300 billion, I will support it as long as it does not touch devolved governments. We have allocated 370 billion to counties, plus conditional grants. This House, we must agree to stand together that in the next allocation, counties must get more than 370 billion, because that is the reason for our existence. When you go back to your county, you'll be asked what you've done over the last 5 years. You've not been building classrooms, you've not been building police stations, but you can proudly say that the allocation for my county has moved from 8 billion to 9 billion during my time in the Senate. Let the cuts look at other things that are discretionary, but not the allocation to county governments. But then we have a challenge, ladies and gentlemen. There's a lot of bad manners in county governments. It is time we made sure that our committees, not just pack and pick, each committee of this House has got an oversight role. If you become lucky to lead a committee, if you become lucky to be a member of a committee, please let's make sure that if we increase our allocations to counties, those allocations will go towards development rather than towards fattening the accounts of those who are there. We must also, as a House, take a common stand to threats to devolution. We have heard the President talk about housing. The national government's job is only housing policy. Provision of social housing is a function of county governments. We've heard the President talk about water and PPPs. The national government's role is just policy. The issue of provision of water is a function of county governments. And we must unbundle all these water services boards and make sure that counties have got direct access to those resources. We've heard the President talk about fertilizer. The role of the national government is policy. Execution is a role of county governments. Let us have a bipartisan position, ladies and gentlemen, on these matters. Because if there are affronts to devolution, it does not matter whether the President has got good intentions or not. You cannot, good intentions are not bankable. What is important is fidelity to the Constitution. Housing, water, agriculture, roads, All these are things that the national government continues to pour a lot of funds in, and not to mention health. We had the universal health experiment, which collapsed because there was not sufficient consultation with county governments. Mr. Speaker, the issue of CDF will come to this House. Let no one lie to you that if you gave the National Assembly their CDF, they'll give you your oversight fund. Let nobody lie to you. We have heard that lie over the last 7 years, that you just pass this bill and then the Treasury CS is going to ensure your regulations are passed. I am saying that on the floor of this House on record and in the Hansard. CDF was relevant when we didn't have county governments. Now that we have county governments, if you want to build things in the village, go run for governor. If you come to this national parliament, represent, oversight, legislate. The only thing we should be willing to discuss is an oversight fund for parliament, not just Senate. An oversight fund for members of the National Assembly and members of the Senate. Ladies and gentlemen, the minute we agree that we grant CDF so that we can get our oversight fund is the day we will be undermining devolution. What is so difficult about providing a conditional grant to county governments to build schools? Mr. Speaker, you find that a school next to the governor's office is dilapidated and the governor can do nothing about it, simply because he does not have access to the relevant funds. Mr. Speaker, let's be united on this matter. The courts ruled that the matter of CDF must come through the Senate, there must be public participation.
Thank you, my good friend.
But the light is still on until it goes off. I mean, it needs to go off.